Toma's story from the Sudan. Toma helped her mother bring out the food for the midday lunch. As the oldest daughter in the home at 9 years of age, she was responsible for helping with the meals. They set down the bowls in a big pot on the table, which sat in the shade under a big tree in the courtyard of their compound. Her mother, Arbaba, began filling the bowls with the sweet-smelling porridge, made with sorghum, onions, okra, all in a tomato sauce. Everything in the meal was grown on the land farmed by her father. Toma passed the bowls to her family, who were already seated. The first bowl, the biggest of course, went first to her father Kamis. He was not only a successful farmer and the head of their family, but he was the chief of the village. He was the person to whom everyone came for advice, to solve disputes, or, if an agreement could not be reached, to finally make a decision that all would abide by. He was known as being fair and honorable, and he was, in some ways, like the father for the entire village. Next, Toma put bowls down for her brothers. First came Saddam, 11, then Ahmed, 7, and Malik, who was 6. After serving the males, he served her sister, Sayeda, who was 8. Finally, she placed a bowl before her mother's place, and the last one for herself. Toma was sad that they couldn't be at school today. They hadn't been to school for weeks. It wasn't close. They would leave at 7 in the morning, taking some of the family's donkeys, and ride for 2 hours. Then, after being in school for 4 hours, they would ride back. It wasn't the distance that was stopping them now, though. It was the danger. Armed men, roving gangs of militia, known as the Janjaweed, attacked members of their tribal groups. Villages were raided, burned to the ground, people killed, kidnapped, or raped. And it was rumored that these men were supported by the government soldiers who were supposed to be protecting the villagers. For Toma, these were all just stories. In her village, all was quiet and calm and peaceful. It was as it always was. She couldn't imagine any of those things happening here. Her father wouldn't allow anything bad to happen. With the meal finished, the girls began cleaning up and the boys began to hook up the water containers to 3 of the donkeys. They were going to bring water up to the house from one of the village wells. That's when they heard the sounds. It was faint at first, like a popping sound. Then it got louder. It was gunfire. They stopped and turned to stare at their father. He'd know what to do. He looked scared. Now Toma was scared. "Everybody into the huts," he yelled. Toma froze in place, unable to comprehend what was going on, unable to move. "Everybody hide in the huts," her father yelled. Still she didn't move. The sound of the gunfire got louder, and she could hear screams and the horses' hooves pounding against the ground, but still she couldn't move. Toma was practically yanked off her feet as her mother grabbed her by the hand and pulled her and Sayeda into the girls' hut. Their father led the boys into the hut where the boys slept. They were 2 little structures made of branches and straw that sat on either side of a small building constructed of brick and stone where her parents slept. As they scrambled into the hut, Toma looked back, trying to see over the fence that surrounded their whole compound. Straw and branches could keep the chickens in and wild animals out, but what good would it be against men on horses? "Quickly, get under the mattresses, hide under the beds," her mother yelled. Both girls began crying, and their mother grabbed Sayeda and forced her to hide, piling the mattress and blankets and clothing on top of her until she had disappeared completely. Toma suddenly felt so exposed, so vulnerable, and she too scrambled under her bed. She felt her mother piling things on top of her. "Both of you stop crying," their mother yelled. "If they find you, they will kill you." Hearing those words, the sobs got caught in her throat. She was terrified, but she knew she needed to be silent. She placed a hand against her mouth, trying to force the sound to stay inside of her. The silence inside the hut only made the sounds outside even louder. There were tremendous shrieks and screaming, punctuated by rapid, loud gunfire, all against the background of the horses' hooves, so loud that it was almost as if she could feel the earth trembling under her. She tried to picture the scene outside, but knew she couldn't allow that. She closed her eyes tightly and covered her ears, blocking out the sound, trying to pretend that none of this was real. that none of this was happening, but she knew. The adults of the village tried to keep things away from the children, but Toma was old enough to not only hear the hushed stories, but to understand what was being said. Even worse, she had seen strangers passing through her village, people who had had their homes burned and their livestock taken. Just then she thought of the 4 family donkeys that were tied up just outside of the gate. What was going to happen to the donkeys? No, forget the donkeys. What was going to happen to her family? What was going to happen to her? She wasn't sure of the passage of time. It seemed like she lay there under the mattress for hours. The sound started to fade, and then there was silence. Finally she heard movement in the hut, and was relieved to hear her father's voice calling for them to come out. She pushed away the blankets and covers, and the mattress was lifted off of her. "Are they gone?" she whispered to her father. He nodded, and she felt an instant sense of relief. "They are gone," he said, "for now." Her sense of relief vanished, replaced by the fear she had just experienced. Outside the hut everything seemed the same. The sun was still shining brightly overhead, and the bowls were still there on the table where they'd been left. There was no sight or sound of anything. There was no sound at all. It was just silent, as though even the wind had stopped blowing and was holding its breath, waiting, watching, wondering. It was then that she noticed the smoke rising into the sky, thick and black. Her father had noticed as well. They followed behind him as he went through the gate of their fence. The donkeys that had been tied to the fence were gone. Looking beyond that, she searched for the cattle that had been grazing. They were gone as well. Maybe they'd just been spooked and had run off. She could hope, but she knew that when the Janjaweed came, they often took all the livestock. She was grateful that the goats and sheep and chickens that were inside the fence were still safe, and she hoped that the animals at the farm would be all right. They moved together toward the source of the smoke. It was coming from the far side of the village. Other people came out of their huts, and as they walked their numbers increased until it seemed like everybody in the village was with them. There, on the outskirts of the village, were the charred remains of people's huts. Sitting on the ground were the women and children, people she had known her whole life, crying. The men poked through the ashes trying to find anything that had survived the flames. There was almost nothing. Just like there was almost nothing that could be done to help. The men gathered together and talked. Loud, angry words were spoken, but she wasn't welcome to hear what they spoke about. Instead, she stayed with the women as they made arrangements for the families that had been burned out to stay with other people. Whatever the loss was gone, what remained in the village would be shared with those who now had nothing. The women talked as well, and Toma heard them speak. They said how terrible it had been, the huts burned and livestock taken, but they were grateful that nobody had been killed and that the Janjaweed were gone. Maybe they wouldn't return. Maybe seemed like such a small word. No protection from what might still happen. They were gone, but what was to stop them from coming back? There was a pounding on the door of the hut, and people were screaming. Toma and her sister jumped to their feet and ran out to the courtyard. Her mother and brothers were already there, but where was her father? Then she remembered. He'd already be at the farm. Outside the fence, people were running away, riding donkeys, trying desperately to drive cattle that didn't want to be driven. Nobody needed to tell Toma what was happening. Her family ran through the gate and joined the people running from the village. As she ran, she heard shots. She turned and looked over her shoulder, and her heart froze. Coming into the far side of the village were armed men on horses and camels. They were firing their guns and screaming. People were running in front of them, but they were no match for the racing horses and would be quickly overtaken. The people in front of her ran off the path and scrambled into the tall grass, hiding from the pursuing men, still holding her sister's hand, her mother holding the other, and her brothers in front of them. They all abandoned the path and followed behind, hoping to hide before the men reached them. Off the road they continued to run through the undergrowth, moving quickly, trying to stay silent. Finally, the people in front stopped running, satisfied that they were far enough to be safe, not hearing any sounds pursuing them. Toma lay in the grass, her heart pounding, straining to catch her breath again, while trying desperately to listen to any sounds in the distance. All was quiet. "What are we going to do?" Toma asked. "We'll wait a little longer and then go to the farm." To the farm! To their father. He'd know what to do. Toma's mother got the children to their feet. It was time to move. The family farm was a small patch of fertile land close to groundwater, where they grew the vegetables and fruits that they either ate or traded to support the family. It wasn't far. They could only hope it was far enough that it hadn't been noticed by the armed men. Some of the people from the village moved along with them. Others branched out, heading to their own patches of land or where they knew somebody was tending to a herd of grazing animals. It wasn't long before they reached the farm and told their father what had happened. He hadn't heard any of the sounds, but by now the sky was filled with evidence of what was happening back in the village. They stood there together, watching as thick black smoke rose up into the air, marking the spot where the village was located. More homes were being burned. "We have to hide," Toma's father said. "Everybody come." He led them into the tall grass that lay on one side of their farm, and once again they took refuge where they couldn't be seen. After some time they had heard a different noise, but it wasn't horses, and it wasn't from the ground. It was the sound of a helicopter. They scanned the sky until they could see it, a big military helicopter off in the distance. For a fleeting second, Toma thought that meant that the government had sent it, filled with soldiers to chase away the armed men. Then she remembered what she had heard. The helicopters and the soldiers weren't there to stop anything. They were there to watch. Sometimes even to help the armed men on horses. Even if there were soldiers, they weren't going to stop anything. They stayed in the grass all day, eating some cucumbers and watermelons from the farm. The helicopter had long since gone, and the fires had stopped. The evidence, the black smoke, had blown away by the wind. Slowly, cautiously, they moved back toward the village. As they walked, they were joined by other members of their village. Larger numbers seemed safer, but really there was no safety. They just presented a bigger target. Some of the men, including her father, went ahead. When it was deemed safe for the women and children, they were called to follow. Toma could not believe what she saw. The village was gone. All that remained of almost all of the buildings and fences were charred, still smoldering remnants. A few dead chickens and dogs that littered the ground were all that was left of the animals. The rest were gone, stolen. People moved through the village, expressions of stunned disbelief on their faces. Hopelessly, desperately, men poked through the ashes, trying to glean anything of value that might have survived the pillaging and the flames, but there seemed to be nothing. Possessions that couldn't be taken were scattered about the ground where the huts had stood. So much be lost so quickly. What would drive these men not just to steal, but to destroy? Why did they hate them so much? Why couldn't anybody stop them? So many questions swirled through Toma's mind, and then she saw the bodies. Lying on the ground, scattered throughout the smoldering remains, were the bodies of people who had not been able to flee in time. "Look away," her mother warned. "Don't look at the bodies." Toma wanted to look away, but she couldn't. These weren't just strangers. These were friends, neighbors, and even family members. Tentatively, the survivors moved away, picking their way past the bodies. Some looked like they were just sleeping. Others, though, bore the evidence of what had killed them. Crushed skulls, wounds, and puddles of darkened, blood-stained dirt flowing out from beneath them. They stopped in front of where their home used to be. The fence and the two huts were nothing more than smoldering embers. All that remained of this was the stone and brick building where her parents slept.